Hello and welcome to this week's hospital capacity update video for the United States for Thursday, October 27th, 2022. Like always, we will start off with the national numbers, then we will get to the states that have more than 80% of their beds currently in use. This list actually grew a little bit from last week. It grew by one last week. Last week we had 18. This week we have 19 states to get through. So the national hospital capacity is currently at 78.13% of all beds used. 3.9% of them are being used for coronavirus, 26,983 coronavirus patients, and 545,913 beds are in use. Our first state on the list is Connecticut. In Connecticut, this week is at 81.95%. 5.86% of the beds being used are for coronavirus, 438 coronavirus patients in Connecticut, and 6,188 beds currently being used. The second state on our list is Delaware. Delaware is using 83.59% of all beds. 6.86 are being used for coronavirus, and 181 COVID patients exist in Delaware, with 2,231 beds in use. Our third state this week is D.C., Washington, D.C., District of Columbia, where just 80.94% of all beds are being used. 3.86 are being used for coronavirus, with 125 coronavirus patients. 2,722 beds are being used altogether. Our next state this week is Georgia, and it would appear to me that Georgia is actually continuing to get worse. In Georgia, 86.21% of all beds are being used. 4.58% of beds are being used for coronavirus. 928 coronavirus patients exist in Georgia, and 17,672 of their beds are being used. Next is a state that we have added this week that was not on the list last week, and that is Kentucky. Kentucky passed over the 80% threshold with 80.24% of all beds in use. 3.61% of their beds being used are for coronavirus. 430 beds total are being used for coronavirus, and overall 9,681 beds are currently in use. Some of the reasons why you might be seeing some more states added to this and some states getting worse is RSV and flu are really starting to ramp up now. All right, moving on to our next state on the list, which is Maryland. And Maryland this week reports, here it comes, 83.82% of all beds are in use. 6.08% of that is used for coronavirus. They have 668 COVID patients, and 9,280 beds are used total. The next state on our list, Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is really bad now. 89.14% of all beds are being used in Massachusetts. 4.56% are being used for COVID. 830 COVID patients in Massachusetts, and 16,330 beds being used total in Massachusetts. I would say flu, RSV, maybe even long COVID is a big factor in this. The next state on our list is Michigan. Let's take a look at Michigan for this week. Michigan has 83.12% of their beds in use. 5.62% are used for coronavirus, and they have a total of 1,154 COVID patients, with 17,191 beds being used. Next state is Minnesota. And here we go. Minnesota this week has 86.79% of all beds being used. 6.29% of their beds are being used for coronavirus, and 583 COVID patients are currently hospitalized in Minnesota, with 8,166 total beds being used in their state. Missouri is the next state on our list. And Missouri this week has 85.79% of all beds being used. 5.08% of their beds are being used for coronavirus, and 752 coronavirus patients exist in their hospitals, with 12,922 beds being used total in the state. New Hampshire is the next state on our list. And in New Hampshire this week, we have 81.76% of all beds being used. 5.26% of that is being used for COVID, with 137 COVID patients and 2,129 patients total. Next on our list is New York State, and in New York State, 81.97% of all beds are currently being used, with 6.66% of them being used for coronavirus. Their total for coronavirus patients is 2,546, with 31,717 total beds being used in the state. I am a little bit suspect about this COVID patient total. If you're watching any of my video, especially the New York State update video yesterday, you would have seen that this was actually over 3,000 yesterday, so not sure why that had such a big drop. Moving on to Ohio, that's going to be our next state on our list, and in Ohio, 81.77% of all beds are currently in use, 4.87% are being used for coronavirus, with 1,286 COVID patients in Ohio, and a total of 21,782 beds being used in Ohio. Oregon, this is a new state this week that was not on the list last week, at least I don't think it was. And Oregon is using 80.02, just barely makes the threshold, 80.02% of all beds, with 4.74% of them being used for coronavirus, and 308 COVID patients in their hospitals, with a total of 5,326 people hospitalized in Oregon. Next one is my state of Pennsylvania. And, well, things are getting worse here in Pennsylvania, at least on the COVID front. 80.92% of all beds are being used in the state of Pennsylvania, with 5.88% of the beds being used for coronavirus. 1,846 COVID patients this week. That is up from last week, despite, in our state, believe it or not, cases actually dropped, and meanwhile COVID's going up in the hospitals, just like what was happening in New York State last week. Alright, 25,655 inpatient beds are currently in use in the state of Pennsylvania. Rhode Island. Rhode Island is the worst state on our list for hospital capacity. Rhode Island has 92.39% of all beds currently used. That's really bad. 4.46 are being used for coronavirus, but they only have 102 COVID patients, with 2,113 beds in use. Here's the problem in Rhode Island. Rhode Island borders Connecticut. As you know, Connecticut is setting up a field hospital for children, and Rhode Island does border, so they're probably likely having similar issues when it comes to capacity in the children's hospital for RSV, flu, and even coronavirus. Alright, moving on to our next state, South Carolina. South Carolina this week reports, let me grab it, it's far down the list, 80.12% of all beds being used, so they're just over the threshold. So they're actually improving a little bit, and that's a good news. Hopefully next week we can take them off the list, with 2.27% of the beds being used for coronavirus, and 214 COVID patients in South Carolina, with 7,712 beds total being used. Next, second to last, would be Washington State. Washington State this week reports 84.12% of all beds are being used, with 3.3% being used for coronavirus, and 372 COVID patients exist in their state, with 9,102 patients total. Alright, last but not least, West Virginia. This week, West Virginia reports 83.63% of all beds are in use, with 3.63% of those beds being used for coronavirus, 177 COVID patients total, and 4,153 inpatient beds being used total in the state for all illnesses. Alright, this concludes this week's report. We'll have another one of these next week. Hopefully we can eliminate some more states on the list, but I'm afraid we probably won't, and if the list grows any larger, I will have to up the threshold higher to maybe 81 or 82%, just so the list does not get too long. And if we have to do that, that means things are not looking too good. Alright, thanks for watching. Stay safe, everyone. And remember, if you want to see more videos like this, hit the like and subscribe button down below. Stay safe, everyone.